Joining us now from Washington via Skype is Fred Fleitz, managing editor of Lignet.com, Newsmax Media's new global intelligence and forecasting site. Fred spent 25 years working on national security issues with the CIA, DIA, the State Department, and the House Intelligence Committee. And Fred, it is so great to have you with us again.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Well, the FBI and DEA have disrupted a plot by elements of Iran's government to kill the Saudi ambassador to the United States on American soil using explosives. Fred, what does this mean?
Kathleen, this is a remarkable development. At first glance, it appears almost unbelievable and an incredibly reckless move by a nation that is already increasingly isolated by the Europeans, who have been reluctant to follow our lead for the last 10 or 12 years to bring pressure against Iran for their nuclear weapons program and for being a state sponsor of terror. This development doesn't really make a lot of sense. However, we know that the one of the two accused terrorists who were arrested has confessed to having a relationship with Iran, that he was ordered to do so. There's records of money transfers from a foreign entity, which the FBI has identified as Iran. And there is a source that the DEA has been working with who says that this person supposedly was working with Iran. This case will have to be studied very carefully to see whether these individuals were rogue agents, were they working with a rogue element of the Iranian regime or not. It looks like it's something that the Iranian government was behind, but we need to examine this very closely to see if that is the case.
Now, obviously, details are still trickling out, but we know that one of the accused attackers is a member of Iran's elite Revolutionary Guard. Is it safe to say then that Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is somehow behind this plot?
Well, the terrorists appear to be part of the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, which is what Iran uses to export revolution. They export revolution by conducting terrorist activities, which have done in Afghanistan and Iraq and in various other places. It's consistent that this is the group Iran would use to carry out such a terrorist activity. Now, what's interesting about Ahmadinejad is that he can't run for re-election. We know his political situation in Iran is perilous right now. There's a separation between him and Supreme Leader Khamenei, and that there's an effort by Khamenei's people to keep Ahmadinejad's people from winning this spring's elections. There's concern about what will happen with the spring's elections. So one has to consider the possibility whether this assassination plot and possibly others, and one has to assume that if Ahmadinejad was bold enough to do this, he probably is thinking of other acts of terrorism. Is this related to Ahmadinejad's loss of power, perhaps some way to hold on to power, or some other political dynamic in Iran?
Fred, what is the motive here and why now?
Well, I think that's the question. What would motivate Iran or Iran's leaderships to do this, given how isolated they are right now? It doesn't make a lot of sense for their domestic situation, for the problem they're having with dissenters, which they're aggressively suppressing. It's hard to see what Iran would get out of this. Now, Iran has a terrible beef with the Saudis. They're very angry with the Saudis and assisting with the revolution in Bahrain, which Saudi forces are actually in Bahrain, helping the Bahrainis keep down these revolutionaries in Bahrain are Shiites. Iran is not happy about that, and that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is involved in that. But at the end of the day, as I said at the beginning, this doesn't make a lot of sense, and we need to study it to find out who is really behind it and what the motivations were.
Okay, one of the suspects is in custody, a 56-year-old naturalized U.S. citizen with Iranian and U.S. passports. The other suspect remains at large, Gholam Shakuri, who is a member, as we discussed, of a special operations unit of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. According to the feds, they were plotting to blow up a restaurant that the ambassador was known to frequent. Numerous bystanders would have been killed. Had the plot gone through, just how deadly would it have been, and what would have been the consequences for the U.S.?
Well, I think the consequences would have been enormous. There would have been significant collateral damage, and in the indictment, the arrested plotter said he didn't care about collateral damage. I think that we also need to consider, when we look at the size of this attack, that if Iran is able to do this in the United States, it's a very serious concern for U.S. security. How could Iranian agents pull off such a thing or get so close to pulling off such a thing. That's something that really needs to be looked into.
Now, in your view, is this just as much an attempted attack on the U.S. as it was on the Saudi ambassador?
I think it was mostly an attack on the Saudi ambassador, but the idea that an attack on the Israeli embassy was thrown in also, I don't really understand the significance. It could be that there are rogue elements in Iran who wanted to send a message to the United States. In some ways, it's consistent with a recent threat by an Iranian admiral that Iran will soon station naval ships off the coast of the United States, and maybe it's some type of muscle flexing exercise. But in the end, the consequences to Iran, if the government is really behind this, in terms of isolating them, will be pretty severe.
Now, how should the U.S. hold Iran accountable for this?
Well, so far, although the United States, I heard in the press conference today, there were allusions that this was being considered an act of war. It's pretty clear the United States is not really considering an act of war because we did not take military action, and the two suspects are being treated as criminal suspects, although we are assuming that they have a relationship with the Iranian government. It looks like we're going to go through diplomatic channels. We have already talked to the Swiss government. Switzerland represents our interest in Iran since our embassy was closed in 1979. It appears that we're going to try to ask for an explanation for the Iranian government. I'm sure we're also working with our European allies to try to find out what was this about. And I think it will result in, if it looks like the Iranian government was behind it, I think there will be significant ratcheting up of sanctions. And this also could be something that we could use to go to China and Russia. China and Russia have been shielding Iran from international sanctions in the United Nations. And action like this makes it difficult for Iran and China, both of which have already been holding their noses when it comes to diplomatic action against Iran in the UN. It could pressure Russia and China to finally take the step to agree to tougher sanctions against the Iranian regime.
Now, Fred, you said that the U.S. right now is not acting as if this were an act of war. You've been in the intelligence community and have been very plugged in for a long time. In your view, is this an act of war?
If the Iranian government is behind it, it's an act of war. And I think that if the Obama administration believed it was an act of war, well, I guess it's hard to say. It could be they simply were reluctant to take military action against Iran because of what the consequences would be. It could be that the Obama administration still has to determine were rogue elements and perhaps not the president or the supreme leader behind or aware of this incident. And while you mentioned the intelligence community, I should have said at the beginning, this is a tremendous victory for the U.S. intelligence community. The fact that our intelligence agents were able to pull this off and that it was kept secret because the president was told about this in June, it is really a credit to the professionalism and the capabilities of our intelligence officers.
All right, Fred Fleitz, managing editor of Lignet.com. Thanks so much for joining us. And Fred, thanks so much for your insight.
Thank you, Kathleen.